Welcome to the Anatomy Dissection Laboratory for students. In this video, we will show you how to bisect the head and neck. Dr. Carlos Suarez-Quian and Joe Valensky are the authors of this presentation. Dr. Suarez-Quian is the narrator. Examination of the upper airway and alimentary canal requires that we bisect the head and neck. Only then will we be able to visualize muscles that control movement of our soft palate and, as well, gain an appreciation of how complex the transit is of the cranial nerves from their exit in the skull to their final destinations in the nasal, oral, and laryngeal cavities. Let's bisect the head and neck. It is much easier to bisect the head and neck using a power saw than a hand saw. Select a saw you can handle safely and remember to wear safety goggles. Now, let's identify the bones we will need to saw in half to bisect the head and neck. We identify the frontal bone, then the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. The sphenoid bone is next, followed by the sella turcica, also a part of the sphenoid bone. The sella turcica simply means Turkish saddle in Latin because it resembles such a saddle. It is also known as the hypophyseal fossa for the pituitary gland. The next bone we will cut is the occipital bone, and this smooth part of the bone is known as the clivus. Clivus simply means slope in Latin, hence the name for this part of the occipital bone. And then, after crossing the foramen magnum, the saw blade will again enter the occipital bone, specifically the internal occipital crest. When choosing which side of the cristigallus to start your bisection, select the side on which the opening of the nostril is smaller. This will guarantee that you leave the nasal septum intact. Start your sawing. Be careful that the blade does not bounce and cut your hand. Continue to apply pressure until the two halves of the skull begin to fall apart. You are likely at the hard palate at this point. This particular skull took a while to cut through the hard palate, but ultimately we succeeded and the two halves of the head and neck began to fall apart. Finally, the two halves of the head or neck are completely separated, and we now discover the reason for our difficulties in sawing through the hard palate. The cadaver had dentures. One would think that if the saw blade can go through bone, then it would easily go through dentures. Unfortunately, this is not a correct assumption. Dentures are often made of acrylic resin and metal, which can damage the saw blade. Nevertheless, we were able to saw through the head and neck, and now we label structures for orientation. Here's the nasal septum, the hard palate, the tongue in the oral cavity, the larynx, although I recognize it is hard to see at this time, and finally, the space behind the nasal, oral, and laryngeal cavities, known as the pharynx. This now concludes the bisection of the head and neck.